Hello, everyone, and welcome to Reject Modernity, Embrace Tradition, the show where we take you back to the good old days, just probably not exactly how you would expect from our title. My name is Clayton Becker.
And I'm Megan Cox.
And Megan, what are we going to be talking about today?
Today, Clayton, we are rejecting hustle culture and embracing downtime.
Rejecting hustle culture. All right. Great information to have from two people who started a podcast in their free time.
But have we monetized? No, we have not.
No, we haven't. This is not a side hustle. It's true. This is just a hobby. And hobbies, my friends, are just fine. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about sort of what hustle culture is first, like its historical antecedents, how we got here. So I want to just set the scene just a little bit to understand sort of the actual impacts of hustle culture and sort of the things that surround it. So it is true that over time there's this like secular decline in the number of working hours in large industrialized countries. This just happens over time. Every country basically in our peer group has seen the number of hours we work decrease. But that decrease has not been parallel across countries. In 1970, the average worker in the United States worked 1,857 hours per year. And that includes
and for those of you who don't have this number committed to memory, 2,080 hours is what you would work if every single week you worked 40 hours a week.
Yes.
So that number is a little bit below what every worker would be working if they worked 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year.
Yeah, and the reason that this is a little bit lower than that is because this includes both full-time and part-time workers. It's hard to differentiate at like a population level just because we don't often ask people when we ask for their working hours, right? Like whether they're working a full-time job or a part-time job. And it's difficult to try to separate the two. So we combine these into statistics of like the average number of hours worked per worker, including both full-time and part-time workers. In 1970, that figure was below nearly every single one of our peer nations. So we worked nearly 100 hours less per year than the French. So slightly more than 10 working days, right, of 8-hour days, less than the French. Nearly 200 hours less than, more than 100 hours less than the Germans, nearly 200 hours less per year than the Italians, nearly 400 hours less than the Japanese, and nearly 500 hours per year less than the average Irish worker. That's several days up to several weeks less time, just measured in sort of 24 hours rather than in 8-hour work days, than basically any of our peer nations, those that are sort of at the same stage of economic development as the United States.
Really turning on its head our stereotypes about Europeans and their month-long vacations.
Exactly, right? Like we worked fewer hours per year than most of our European counterparts. We had higher GDP per capita, we were more productive, so on and so forth, but we worked less in terms of the actual hours we worked per year. And that's something we should want, right? Like we should want to have high productivity, like low number of working hours, because it means you have more time to do other things in your life, basically. By 2017, we worked an average of 1,742 hours per year. So it did go down, part of that long-term secular decline that I talked about just since the Industrial Revolution. But by 2017, every single one of those peer nations that I just mentioned worked fewer hours than workers in the United States. Today, we work nearly 100 hours more per year than the average Canadian, nearly 250 hours more per year than the French, and more than 400 hours per year more than the average German worker. The Irish, who just 50 years ago worked 500 hours more per year than we did, they worked 11 hours less than us on average in 2017. So we saw a small decline in our number of working hours, and basically every single one of our peer nations saw a much greater decline. They have much more time to do things, even as their national incomes, their GDP, and their GDP per capita have increased substantially since that time period.
That's the really important thing. It's not that they're working less and getting poorer. It's that they're working less and are as rich or richer than we are.
I would say if you adjust per number of hours worked, it is quite close between Europe and the United States. But largely because of the fact that we work so many more hours, the United States does have a substantially higher GDP per capita than most of those states. We had a substantially higher GDP per capita already in 1970, so it's not like, exactly we're like gaining ground on them necessarily. But the big caveat there is we have a higher GDP per capita, and we're also working like 20 to 30 more working days per year of like 8-hour work days, right? So it sort of averages out in terms of the like, you're getting what you're working for, as it were. And there's not necessarily like huge, great evidence that like the American quality of life is substantially higher because of that higher GDP per capita. Because as we've talked about in the past, we do all sorts of dumb things with it, like subsidizing suburban sprawl and buying large cars. And Europeans just don't do that in the same way we do. But anyway, I set the stage like this basically to say that there are, of course, many reasons for this divergence between the United States and the rest of the world. But one of these key reasons, and Megan is about to jump in here with some more historical details, especially in the last decade, which has actually seen American working hours increase. The inflection point is, as Megan is about to explain, the Great Recession. It is 2009. Is hustle culture. One of those reasons is hustle culture. So Megan, why don't you give us a little bit of the historical breakdown of how this has developed over the last, say, 15, 20 years?
Really unnerved by something that I'm about to describe almost entirely through lived experience being described as historical. But
I'm sorry, Megan. It's not my fault that I was born after you.
All right. So the emergence of hustle culture, I think we're going to talk a little bit about how it is a little more voluntary now. But when it emerged during the Great Recession, it was not voluntary. And it was certainly not perceived as voluntary by the people who were living within it. Pre-recession, the only people talking about hustle were in sales or were working for multi-level marketing schemes. The idea that you would voluntarily want to work one normal 40-hour job and then pick up an additional job was not something that the middle and upper middle class really were embracing.
Yes, I can't speak to this directly. I was too busy being 12 in 2009. But yeah, I mean, like, it is sort of true that the stereotype of like the sales guy who's hustling around the country doing door to door,
like Glengarry Glen Ross kind of
exactly, right?
Idea, yeah.
And this is it sort of comes a little bit out of an even older strain of hustle culture, which is like the hustle culture described in, magazines and news articles and everything of like the early tech companies, the early internet companies like Google and Facebook, where you'd have people like, all living together in a house and working, 12, 13, 14-hour days, even more sometimes, right? Sleeping in their office, that kind of thing.
Yes. And that's a great point that tech culture does start to emerge fairly early, that people will be working long hours, maybe not attending to their home life or hygiene, etc. That's where a lot of that stereotype comes from, is people living in their offices, not really stopping to have any sort of work-life balance.
Yeah, and that starts to sort of bleed outside of the tech ecosystem in the late 90s, early 2000s. And then when the recession hits, it turns from people are going to do this to get ahead. We'll talk about exactly the problems with that a little later, but to something that you sort of need to do in order to keep your head above water.
Yes. And so as the Great Recession starts to roll in, you see in a number of industries a casualization of the workforce and an increasing precarity. And it just so happens, kind of quote unquote, that some of those job losses are really concentrated in culture setting in industries like journalism, what we would now call content creation. Newspapers, or the more, traditional legacy media, was already kind of under attack from the internet in a way that was undermining their primary revenue streams. I think a lot of people thought that subscriptions were what paid for your local newspaper. And by local, I mean, the Dallas Morning News, kind of like large metropolitan newspapers, not your little West Lynn Tidings kind of thing.
Wow, a West Lynn reference. Wow.
West Lynn reference on the pod.
Hyper local reference for those of you from the Portland metro area.
Exactly, but that's the point. It's like, well, I just happen to remember that it's the West Lynn Daily Tidings or whatever.
Yeah, we're talking about the Oregonian, not the West Lynn Daily Tidings.
Very small paper. But these big newspapers are being undermined by primarily Craigslist, because these newspapers are making their money off of advertising, classifieds, apartment listings, all of this stuff that is replaced by a free service that you can just hop on the internet, and it's dial up and maybe it takes a while, but you can use it much more easily than waiting for the newspaper or placing an ad for money in the newspaper. The same thing goes for any service. You don't need to advertise your plumbing business, etc. If somebody can hop online and Google best most responsive plumbers in Beaverton or whatever, you have that. Now we're just working our way around the suburbs. We have now the technology to do that in an easier way for both the business and the consumer that cuts out newspapers and other media. So you see the staffs of media organizations shrink. So many more people are freelancing, meaning they do not have a regular employer and a regular paycheck. They are putting together, often by the article, their ability to live and eat and pay rent.
And so they're working, the equivalent basically on this freelance basis of 6, 7, 8 jobs, right? Like they are out there doing the hustling, right? And so their attitude towards it sort of becomes, this is normal now, right?
Yes, it normalizes it.
After a couple of years, you get the, sure, at the very beginning, it's like, well, this sucks. Why does everyone have to do this, right? But after a few years, and as more people continue entering the profession, right? And
the people who are better at it stay in it.
Yeah, and the people who are entering the profession have not known a time when it was not like this, right? It becomes this sort of normalized thing. And because it's normalized in these taste-setting, culture-making institutions, it bleeds out into the rest of the mass public.
Additionally, you have, at the same time, this is not so much of a side hustle versus main hustle issue as a what we might term workaholism, because we want to victim blame, for lack of a better term. You have people who are seeing layoffs and cuts in their industry who are desperate to hang on to the job that they do have, and they lose any sense of work-life balance and any sense of the ability to set boundaries, because it is a buyer's market for labor. It is an employer's market for labor. So you don't tell your boss, I'm sorry, I can't actually work 60 hours this week. That's not going to work for me. And
if there's someone who's willing to, yeah.
Yes, there is someone who's willing to, and if you do that, you can just get fired. So it's fine. You start to kind of adopt the ability to, structure your life around working that much. That's really what the economy is doing at that point. At the same time, I think we want to move on to talking about the Affordable Care Act now and its implications for people who are working and people who are working part-time. The Affordable Care Act does make it easier for people to freelance, to start their own business, etc., because of the marketplace. But it also incentivizes employers to keep employees at less than 30 hours per week, because the 30-hour per week line is where the requirement that healthcare be provided by an employer kicks in.
So if you're in an industry, or if you're just in a job that is paid hourly rather than being salaried, the employer has a really strong incentive to keep your hours just under that 30 hours per week threshold. And so if you're only working 29 hours a week, right, even if the hourly rate is relatively high, you're still probably going to be incentivized to develop some sort of side hustle to increase your income, to then help you buy insurance on the exchanges, even if you're getting a subsidy, right? Like
Absolutely.
the
Absolutely. You also see intermittent scheduling is something that employers are using where they will call you in on the day and you have to basically promise that you're not taking another job. That means that you can't come in whenever they want you to. So there's a strong incentive to pick up that second job or third job that is completely discretionary. You can just get in your car, log into Uber or Lyft and pick up a couple of extra rides without scheduling yourself at all.
yeah, exactly.
So that's what's going on.
And I think a big part of this is like the monetization of hobbies, right? Like
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
people
Yeah,
are
you
trying to
really,
find people are trying to find ways to monetize the things that they're already doing, right? And because the things that you're already doing as hobbies, those are things that are more discretionary, right? And so even if it's not something like Uber or Lyft or whatever, it's something like if you're a person who does rock climbing, then you decide, oh, I'm gonna teach a rock climbing class a couple of times a week. If you're someone who does some other fitness, if you're a tennis player, you're like, oh, I'm gonna try to teach a little bit of tennis to people. If you're someone who took math in college, you're gonna say, oh, well, I might pick up a couple of tutoring shifts, right?
yeah. And
It
this
doesn't
is a
have to
big part of,
just be it doesn't have to just be the things that we're talking about when we think of like the gig economy. It can
Mhm.
be things that are like quote unquote realer jobs, but that you weren't doing previously, and previously were just things that you found interesting for yourself.
Yeah. And you start to see people monetizing things that they would be doing anyway, or things that they were already good at anyway. And one of the things that everybody kind of was doing anyway and had access to was a camera on their phone. So this is where you start to see it's Instagram, if you cast your mind back, which Instagram only came out in I think 2012. But early Instagram was people who liked taking pictures and really enjoyed that sort of visual medium. Posting pictures that they took because they enjoyed it. So you've got your rock climbing guy that maybe really enjoys rock climbing and might be a rock climbing instructor on the side. Maybe his third job is taking pictures of cool rock climbing things and posting them on Instagram. And all of a sudden, he's got a rock climbing community following him. You see those little niches start to develop of people who early Instagram influencers are people who genuinely enjoy a thing, and it's just sort of creating an organic community. But this, like many of the other things that turn bad or sour in terms of side hustles, when people start to need to treat it like a real business, it kind of stops being as usable for the consumer or as beneficial for the consumer, shall we say.
Yeah. And as these platforms like Instagram and YouTube and Facebook, and then, a decade later, TikTok start rolling out like incentive programs for creators, not just through like brand partnerships and stuff, but like, revenue sharing from the applications, the companies themselves. You have this pretty strong economic pressure for people who are doing these things to become the first lifestyle influencers. Like, this is a thing that doesn't really exist prior to the recession and prior to everybody having a smartphone in their pocket, right? The ability to access the internet from anywhere at any time at your whim, right, only has existed for the last 15 years. And really, more like only the last decade or so, because like mobile connectivity has just gotten so much better over that time period. And so what was only a thing that you could observe in, like TV news reports, in magazines, in news stories in prior decades of people who live their lives like this, people who at one point might have been what we would call human interest stories, right, are now people who have followings of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people in some cases, who just want to see these people live their authentic lives. We'll talk a little bit about that in just a bit. But the upshot is that this is something that's only really been possible in the last 10 to 15 years. And it coincides with this time period where hustling is necessary for a lot of people. And so it's just this perfect storm of a situation where hustle culture is being normalized. You see people who seem to have their lives put together, right? Doing it. And then those people are becoming the first lifestyle influencers. And you're like, man, this person has it all figured out. So I should do what they're doing.
And that's bad, it turns out. It
turns out that it's not particularly good for you. Do we want to move to sort of all of the reasons why this is bad for you, or do you have anything?
Okay. Absolutely. No, we've covered most of my kind of history of what has happened and how we got here. Really, like, I would close that section out by saying, now we have the perception that we have all the tools we need to be making money at our fingertips 100% of the time. So now that creates a certain amount of pressure to be making money 100% of the time.
Yeah, the idea is, I think this is sort of like the distilled form of hustle culture, right? Which is like the idea that you always need to be doing something productive. The idea that downtime is bad and should be shunned, basically. You see this sort of in like the monetization, I think, of the gaming space in particular, where like, you know, I don't have any problem with people who want to stream on Twitch, for example, but like, you know, a hobby that used to be something that you absolutely did not make money on, like if you're even passingly good at video games these days, there is pressure to become a Twitch streamer, right? And I think that the best way I've seen this described, just like, you know, fully and holistically, I'm going to read a quote for you here, is that hustle culture equates busyness with productivity, exhaustion with accomplishment, and most dangerously, self-worth with professional success. Again, all of this comes out of sort of this 20, 30-year long, transition from the drivers of the economy being things like manufacturing and professional services to it being things like technology and lifestyle influencing and all of that, right? Because hustle culture in its sort of like original form, its original state, is just sort of like a corporate work environment. We talked about how its myth was built by the early success of Google and Facebook. Like the founders and employees of these businesses spoke about work in this way that was all encompassing. We mentioned that a little bit earlier. Now we could mention, of course, that there's some survivorship bias here, right? Maybe you've seen the meme of the plane with the, you know, holes in it. The reason that these businesses succeeded is probably not because they worked themselves to death, but just because they had a good idea at the right time. There are plenty of examples of people who had a bad idea at the wrong time, worked themselves to death, and have nothing to show for it. And also we could note that much of their success, much like it wasn't based on people dropping out of college, was also not really based on doing anything but work. And still this myth persists up until today. You have discussions of, you know, companies like Tesla and Twitter where people are sleeping in their offices, where they're working 100-hour weeks, even as those companies do not do particularly well. But the thing about hustle,
you don't get good sleep if you're sleeping on a cot in your office.
Yeah, you don't.
And then it smells gross.
Yeah, you just don't. But the thing is that hustle culture is actually like probably bad for business, right? Like the research that we have suggests that it's not actually a good thing. It doesn't actually help businesses succeed. It leads to higher turnover at all levels of the company, all the way from like entry level positions all the way up to like the executives in the C-suite. It stresses employees out, causes burnout, and at a certain point, it doesn't even actually get that much more done. Research specifically on this question of like worker productivity based on like how long you're working in a given week suggests that for most people, productivity declines sharply after 55 hours a week. The returns to additional working hours are very small.
It makes perfect sense. And if I can offer just a, not even a tech example, a normal people doing fairly normal but high stress jobs example. When I was working in law enforcement, I used to cite very frequently a study from King County, Washington, which is Seattle. that said it found after studying the habits of the deputies, how frequently they worked, and then what the results of their work would be. If you worked an overtime shift in week 1, your probability of having a reportable use of force in week 2, the next week, went up 30%. And so there are a couple of possible mechanisms there. One could just be you're a more active and more involved deputy if you are taking an overtime shift voluntarily. But another possible explanation is the overtime shift, that extra work, decreases your ability to de-escalate a situation, which takes a lot of thought, a lot of observation, and a lot of mental strength and fortitude. So you're seeing just one overtime shift decrease your ability to do your job pretty substantially in a very short amount of time, and that effect lingers.
And I think that we've all sort of experienced this, right? Like we've all had at least one week where we've had to work, like a 60-hour week, basically. And that makes you irritable. That annoys you. And like, I'm sure that we have all experienced, like snapping at someone, right? When we are in a bad mood. And one of the things that puts you in a bad mood is being tired and irritable and not having gotten good sleep, which hustle culture very directly contributes to. And I want to point out here that I said, burnout in the list of things that come out of this. Burnout is a real thing. Like, it's not a buzzword, right? It has an actual definition from the World Health Organization. They describe burnout as a syndrome conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. It is characterized by 3 dimensions. 1, feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion. 2, increased mental distance from one's job or feelings of negativism or cynicism related to one's job. And 3, reduced professional efficacy. So it shouldn't be all that surprising that those who report burnout in the workplace say that they are 63% more likely to take a sick day. This is like from lots of surveys that we've done on this. Half as likely to discuss how to approach performance goals with their manager. 23% more likely to end up visiting the emergency room. 2.6 times as likely to leave their current employer, and 13% less confident in their job performance. All of these things are bad for business, and yet this workplace culture has spread, and it has spread beyond just a workplace culture into being this societal expectation through social media influencers and, as Megan mentioned earlier, these culture writers during sort of the height of the gig economy years during the post-recession period. These are people who always seem to be doing something productive. They're always working or working out or learning something new, or in some way they're engaged in this productive activity or some form of self-improvement. But the thing is here, and I want to be really clear about this, these hustle culture influencers are literally almost all fake. Like, you literally never see their actual routine. Just the carefully cultivated version that they show you on social media. And you also, in particular, never see the small army of support staff and assistants that are often necessary to make that lifestyle possible. Like, at the very least, these people who have 2 million, 3 million followers, they have a dedicated person who edits their videos for them. They might have, final sign-off. They might work closely with that person, but it is necessary at that point, if you're producing that much content, to have somebody who does that for you. I think Hank Green is a good example of this, and he's very clear and open that he films all of his stuff, and then he sends it to his assistant Peyton, who he highlights on his account very often, to make it clear that he doesn't have time to do all of the stuff that he does if he were then also editing his videos like he used to, right? He's very transparent in that way. And most influencers simply aren't. With the upshot here, the TLDR being, but these people are living super highly curated lives, fully dependent on other people's work. And that lifestyle, the way they are presenting it as this goal that you should be shooting for, is simply not attainable in the way that they are presenting it. And that causes you to engage in behavior that doesn't actually have the payoff you think it's going to have, and that ultimately makes you worse off in the long run. At least for most people, it makes you worse off in the long run. And the thing is, this wouldn't like necessarily be a problem if it were like just people who wanted to hustle doing all the hustling, right? Or if it like weren't just this workplace culture thing and there weren't this societal pressure to engage in it. But the fact is that both of those things are extremely present, and hustle culture has some pretty negative long-term health outcomes. Like, I was doing the research for this episode, and I didn't realize just quite how bad it is. Do you want me to? I'm going to throw a few numbers at you here, if that's all right. And I've been talking for a little while here, but I guess like I shouldn't be surprised that this has negative health outcomes.
No. It's like primarily, we are talking about sacrificing sleep, and we are talking about generating for yourself a sense of stress in order to get all of these things done. At least for me. I don't know how other people's brains work, I suppose. But if I want to get a big long list of things done, there's got to be some sort of stress for me to be achieving all of those things, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, work well under pressure, right? Is that what people say?
Oh yeah, it thrives in a fast-paced environment. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess like I shouldn't be surprised by all of the stuff that I found doing the research for this episode, but I am a little bit shocked at just how bad some of these impacts are. So, most of the studies on this question define like being a hustler or like working in a hustle culture oriented environment as working on average more than 55 hours a week. I don't know why they settled on 55 hours a week. It seems to have been somewhat of an arbitrary choice, but nonetheless, this feels like what I've seen in most of the studies that I found on this. They define overworking yourself, working in a hustle culture oriented environment is more than 55 hours per week.
11 hours per day, 5 days a week.
Yeah,
that's a weird number.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure why, but that's the number we seem to have gone with here.
Okay.
My guess is that like someone did it first, and then everyone was like, yeah. Cool, makes sense.
We'll keep doing that. Like we get stuck with longitudinal study questions.
Yeah, I mean, it's like what?
With this nonsense.
It's like slightly more than a third of 40 hours a week, right? So like, maybe it's some percentage. Anyway.
All right, whatever.
Long story short, working these long hours is associated with all sorts of negative health outcomes in the long term, ranging from increased rates of generalized anxiety, depression, sleep deprivation, and more in terms of just the mental health impacts. But it's not solely limited to these mental health impacts. And that's the thing that I found a little bit more surprising. As important as
you haven't worked with cops.
as important as mental health is, these physical health impacts were a little more shocking to me. Working these long hours seems to carry an increased risk of chronic diseases like chronic fatigue, frequent headaches, digestive problems, high blood pressure, and even higher risk of certain cardiovascular diseases. One large-scale 2018 study of roughly 740,000 men and women found that working more than 55 hours per week was associated with a 12% increase in coronary heart disease and a 21% increase in the risk of major stroke, which is insane to me. Like, just totally insane.
I think it makes perfect sense, because if you're inducing this high-stress environment for yourself, like, you're not running into a burning building, you're trying to finish payroll, like, it's not the same thing, but you are stressing yourself out, or your employer is stressing you out to a point where your body is responding as if you are encountering the same stress as a first responder. I'm not surprised by this at all. It makes perfect sense.
Well, Megan, I guess you're just smarter than me.
I have different experience than you do, but the fact is, we and society are creating a completely unnecessary amount of stress in people who do not need to be this stressed.
Yes, agreed. Well, on that note, why don't we take a little bit of a break? Megan and I are going to take just a tiny bit of downtime here, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about whether there's anything we can do to solve this problem. because there are some policy causes, but mostly it's sort of this cultural phenomenon. So we'll talk about what we might be able to do to help overcome that cultural phenomenon, and what you can do in your own life if you find yourself experiencing these things to try to get yourself out of this sort of hustle culture induced health scare. I'll be back in just a little bit.
Welcome back. When we left you, we were busily discussing all of the many negative implications of hustle culture, including it might give you a stroke. We'll see.
I guess we'll see. Yeah, like it's not going to give me a stroke currently. Might later.
No, I'm feeling pretty relaxed right now, so I think we're going to be okay. But we should talk about solutions,
yeah,
right?
We should talk about how we get ourselves out of here. I think up at the top of this second half of the podcast, we want to differentiate a couple of things here, which we sort of conflated, I think, in the first half.
I agree. Yeah,
which is we want to talk about the differentiation between people who are hustling because they feel they have to in order to just survive, in order to like make rent payments and afford food, from the people who are hustling because they think, if I don't hustle, then I'll never be a multimillionaire, right? The people who are hustling because they have been influenced by these lifestyle influencers and spend an additional 10 hours a week learning French as part of a like self-improvement kick, even if nothing they plan to do in their lives actually involves that, right? Not to say you can't enjoy learning French, right? But if you're doing it because you feel you have to, not because you want to, then there might be a little bit of a problem with that. As Megan described while we were discussing this during the break, you have to Marie Kondo your life a little bit and do things that provide you with a bit of joy, rather than things you feel are like necessary to help yourself get ahead, further ahead than you already are. So we want to make that distinction. And so some of the solutions we're going to present here are going to be more applicable to the first camp or to the second camp. They're not all the same solution for each kind of person.
Absolutely. So let's start with folks in the first camp, which is you must work 3 jobs in order to pay rent, buy food, and survive. Let's talk about the solutions that we can generate for those folks. Unfortunately, we've talked about a number of those solutions on other episodes of this podcast. Have we not?
Yes, go check out those extra episodes of the podcast. Feel free. I think one of the key ones here that we've talked about is this idea of increasing worker power, right? Increasing unionization rates, making sure that employers have to treat employees with dignity, right?
Yes. And so we can do that through either unionization, as we've discussed, increasing worker power through solidarity, or we can do that through regulation, things like right to unplug laws, which disincentivize overwork or workaholism in employees.
Yeah, or for certain types of professions, things that are scheduled more hourly, things that, are hard to like directly say, oh, you have to have all of these things. You can have things like scheduling laws, right? Where like we're in
prohibitions on intermittent scheduling.
Yeah, we're in so far as it is possible, you should know your work schedule 2 weeks out, 3 weeks out, right? And only if, someone calls in sick or someone can't make it, right? Only then is it appropriate for your employer to call you in, right? They can't just let you know your schedule the day before, the week before, right? And that helps you plan out your life a little bit better. It helps you understand what you might be doing a couple of weeks from now, and allows you to sort of plan your own downtime, right? And then in keeping with this as well, although I think Megan and I both agree that the Affordable Care Act helped lots of people get health insurance here, we need to, at the very least, figure out a way to stop this incentive structure where people are kept under 30 hours a week and so need to work multiple jobs in order to afford their own health insurance, and remove that incentive for businesses to keep people under 30 hours a week.
Absolutely. I was just going back and listening to our episode on SUVs, and it really strikes me that this is another Obama era rule that was trying to be accommodating towards business, and in doing so created an incentive structure that made things bad in a different way. And really the solution here, because that cap, it's you don't have to do anything under 30 hours, and over 30 hours you need to provide health insurance for employees, despite the fact that businesses are the ones who've been fighting against socialized medicine forever because they get to use it as a benefit. We need to sever the connection between healthcare and employment in this country. And if we can't do that, then we need at least a like hourly, okay, you're working for them for 5 hours. It needs to be, you know, a certain percentage of a healthcare plan needs to be covered, et cetera, et cetera. Something needs to be done to change the incentive structure because the incentive structure is bad for employees.
Yeah, so our preferred solution, to be clear here, is a single payer system, some form of universal healthcare, right?
Ding, ding, ding.
That's what we mean by severing the connection between employment and healthcare, where you have healthcare as a benefit, basically, if you work for any sort of sizable company or whatever, and then you have to get it on your own if you don't have that kind of employment, right? That is what we want to deal with.
We've tried every way to make that work, it seems like, and
except for actual universal healthcare.
Yeah.
But if we can't get that done, or at least sort of in the short term, if we can't get that done, right? If the opposition is too intense or whatever, if there's not the votes in the House and the Senate, what have you, then it does, we think it like at least needs to be some sort of prorated sliding scale where it's not 30 hours, yes, 29 hours, no, more like 29 hours, you know, you cover 95% of healthcare costs, 30 hours, you cover 100% of the healthcare costs, right? It's that, as we talked about in our episode on means testing, it's basically a benefits cliff, right? Not a benefits cliff for the individual exactly, but for the business, essentially. And that kind of structure we need, that kind of incentive structure, there we go.
There we go.
That kind of incentive structure we need to get rid of, right? We need to design these programs in such a way that businesses and employers are like not incentivized to treat employees in this way. Because if there's anything that I think we can sort of agree on, I don't know, there are other things we can agree on, but if there's something we can agree on as us and as listeners, having listened to many of the episodes of this podcast, it's that people are gonna follow their incentives and expectation, right? Not everyone
this
perfectly.
Is the Secret Political Economy podcast.
Yes. Not everyone follows their incentives perfectly, but directionally, they absolutely fucking do. And so we need to create incentive structures that are better for people.
Absolutely.
Another thing that we can do, aside from like healthcare and employment, is we really need to reduce the cost of housing. Almost every category of necessity, right? Like spending on necessity goods rather than sort of like disposable income, all of those have gone down over the last century or so, last 50 years, even last 60 years. People spend way less money relative to the amount of income they make on things like clothes, on things like food. Yeah, like back in 1960, back in 1945, 1930, the average family spent like, you know, between a quarter and a third of their whole income just on food, right? And nowadays it's like a third of that. It's like
I live in a house from
12%.
like the 1900s, just judging from closet size. People had less clothes.
Yeah. People would spend, you know, like 25% of their income on clothing, a third of their income on food, like a third of their income on housing, right? And that left like a tiny, tiny portion for any sort of actual disposable income. And that has changed dramatically in the last, you know, 60, 70 years. People spend less money on clothes and food than they practically ever have, which is one of the reasons why the increase in food prices during the pandemic felt so jarring. Because it was it was the first time that food as a percentage of people's budgets had dramatically increased in basically in living memory, practically. And so, you know, those things have gone down. But housing really hasn't, especially in our biggest metro areas, and especially for young people for whom hustle culture is like the most prevalent, I think, and the most dangerous and stigmatizing for sort of their long-term health, their long-term prospects. In almost basically every single one of the country's most in-demand metro areas, housing prices, housing costs as a share of income have gone up for young people over the last 30 years or so.
And I also think that hustle culture has actually contributed to an increase in housing costs to a certain extent, because I think it's interesting to note that we see this kind of HGTV growth, early recession, mid 2010s as well, as many people found that they were buying older houses and needing to make significant improvements to those houses. We have now kind of gobbled up all of the fixer-uppers, it seems, and we are expecting to get our money back and are pushing those prices up, even in older houses in neighborhoods that wouldn't have been perceived as desirable 20 years ago.
Yeah, this is an observed economic phenomenon called reverse filtering. Let me just explain a little bit. Housing nerd portion of the podcast. So, filtering or moving chains is also an observed empirical thing that happens in healthy housing markets. Over time, the people who move into any given dwelling are, generally speaking, less affluent than the people who just left that housing, right? So the idea being that when my apartment was built in, the 1960s, right? This is when this building was built. The people who moved in were, middle class professionals or whatever, right? And they, lived in the building for 10 years, 15 years, whatever, right? And then the next group of people who moved in were maybe, like one level sort of down in terms of the income distribution, right? Normally in healthy housing markets and housing markets that are expanding and building enough housing to support a growing population, by the time you reach like my generation of people living in this home, this should be a relatively working class apartment, right? It's a 60-year-old building. But instead, it's still filled with young professionals working relatively high income jobs, right? So reverse filtering happens in unhealthy housing markets where instead of seeing people who make, 80% of the previous people's income, you have people who are instead making 110% of the previous people's income. They're making more money. And that's how you get things like gentrification and displacement.
Yeah, just as an example, for those of you who know the Portland area, my great grandparents moved into Selwood from the old country. And it was extremely working class, extremely poor farmers who were living there. And those houses are now $1 million houses.
Yeah, I lived, when I lived in Portland, in John's Landing. And I was told by, people who were older that like, oh, that has like a real reputation. And I was like, what do you mean? It's really nice. There's like a French private school down the road. But it's like they were indexing to their previous, perceptions of the neighborhood, right?
When it absolutely was, like, I don't know.
Yeah, a little more. Yeah, exactly. And so we need to solve this problem of reverse filtering and increasing housing costs in order to make it so that fewer people are feeling like they have to hustle just in order to get by. Like they have to work 2-3 jobs, work 60 hours a week, making, $10 an hour in order to afford rent in their city while they also have a roommate, right? Like that is, again, housing theory of everything person here, right? Like studying housing for the dissertation. I think that's a really big impact on, people feeling like they need to hustle. Because maybe you want to hustle to get into a better place or whatever, right? But that's a different kind of stress, a different kind of hustle from, I don't know if I'm going to be able to make rent this month.
Absolutely.
Moving on perhaps a little bit from the necessity of hustling to the influenced hustling, right? The people who are trying to get ahead because they want to be millionaires. I'd say a big part of this is just like de-influencing yourself, right? Like being aware of all of these sort of negative health impacts, right? And understanding that maybe it's not worth it and maybe it's not actually getting you where you think it's getting you. There is, I would say, no hard and fast rule, right? That the only people who get ahead are the people who are working 60-hour weeks, 70-hour weeks, 80-hour weeks, right? Certainly some people are, right? But not everyone. You don't have to kill yourself in order to have success, to be successful. The job that I worked prior to starting the PhD, I rarely worked more than, say, 50 hours a week, right? I was trying to be efficient with my time. I set boundaries. I was good at my job. And so, I made it clear an expectation that like I would work during normal working hours. I would get my work done. And then hopefully they wouldn't need to contact me outside of those working hours. And in those 2 years that I had that job, I got promoted 3 times. Like, you don't need to prove anything to anyone by working 70 hours a week. What you need to do is you need to prove that you're good at your job. And part of being good at your job is not being so exhausted in the workplace that you can't actually talk to your manager about promotion schedules, about performance expectations, so that you're not ending up in the emergency room or jumping from company to company because of the rampant hustle culture at your job. Exactly.
I think it's important to consider a couple of extra things. We just did an episode on loneliness and making personal connections. If you are exhausted, if you're burnt out, if you're irritable, you're not somebody that people necessarily want to be around. And that makes it harder to make personal connections. If you're prioritizing your time such that you aren't going and interacting with people in in-person spaces, then you aren't going to meet people, make friends, have that kind of social connection. If you are obsessed with waking up at 4 a.m. and hitting the gym at a time when it's only you, and then doing some sort of like face ice bath thingy, I don't get it. I don't get it at all. Then you are not creating those kind of social interactions. So that was my one social media reference, but I have another one. I don't know, Clayton, if you'd seen the side by side of the guy with a normal body and the guy with a ripped body. And it's like, why are women lying about this?
Yes, I did see that. Yes.
And you're just like, like the work that it takes to get an 8-pack isolates you from people.
Yeah, like you see that and you're like, that man is never going to be around. I am not interested in dating this person if they're 100%. Not going to spend time with me.
100%. This person will never spend time with me. And when I cook or when he cooks, it's going to be plain chicken and white rice and broccoli, and that's boring. So it's not appealing because of the lifestyle that it implies. And I think there's a certain other kind of like incel adjacent strain where you have an idea maybe that you will not attract a partner if you're not making at least 6 figures, and you're attaching your monetary worth to your worth to others. That's just not true from anyone you actually want to spend time with. I don't know who listens to this podcast and who needs to hear this message, but if you are in a position where you feel like you have to be making that kind of money, if you have to be a multimillionaire by 30 or whatever to have social connections, you have got the causal arrow backwards.
You do. You have it backwards. I have 3 things to say that all brought up for me. So first of all, most importantly, obviously, my understanding of Megan's orientation towards a very ripped man just means that I have a great handle on the female gaze, everyone. Real man of the women here. Not man of the people, man of the women specifically.
Man of the women. Hey, you are more married than most of the dudes who are commenting.
It's true. I am, in fact, more married in that I am married.
It is a binary state, and you are and they aren't.
Second thing, I think that the like Ashton Hall water bath in the face thing,
the guy with the face ice bath thing,
is a perfect example of the kind of like support staff thing that I was talking about, where like you see him, for lack of better terms, actually these are the best terms. You see him wake up at 3:30 in the morning, dick around for 5 hours, and then only at the very end of the video do you see the hands of the woman bring him his food and see the like woman who made the previous like 5 hours of dicking around possible, right? I think it's a perfect example. And then third and finally here, and I think this is actually the important point that I wanted to make, social skills and being personable, being someone that people like to be around and like to work with, that is merit. That is merit, right? This caused like a big kerfuffle on the internet a few weeks ago, right? But the basic idea here is that like you should be pleasant to work with. people should like you, right? And it is easier for you to get people to help you with things, for you to, advance in your career, to be thought of as someone who the business should, treat well and retain, if people enjoy working with you, right? And if you are the kind of person who says, oh, well, I'm not interested in making work friends. I'm not interested in knowing any of the people that I work with because I'm there to do a job. And then I'm going to go do my side hustle, which is really my main hustle, which is going to make me a millionaire by the time that I'm 30. You're not pleasant to be around. And frankly, that side hustle, for the vast majority of people, is never going to be the main hustle that turns you into a millionaire, right? Far more likely, right? Not to say that you shouldn't do stuff that you're like genuinely passionate about, but for the vast, vast majority of people, the thing that gets you like a stable home life, the thing that means you can like move into a, apartment or condo or house that has space for a family and all of that, that's going to be like a real actual job. Right? It's going to be something that you go and do every day. It's going to be a real thing where you work for another person, another company, right? And if you spend all of your time not engaging with people at that thing that is probably, or should, right, be your actual goal, right? Your actual like plan for how you're going to get comfortable, right? Comfortable sort of in quotes. That means things for different people. And instead sort of speeding through your work and then going and hustling on a 20-hour, 30-hour a week thing, like, it's counterproductive. It's totally counterproductive. And you're going to end up worse off for it, both in terms of your health and probably in terms of your economic prospects. And you just shouldn't do it.
Yep. If you have the option to not hustle, you should not hustle.
Yeah.
And if you don't have the option to not hustle, we should make society better for you.
Yeah, precisely. Right. Like, I think that's it. Right. If you have the option to not hustle, you probably shouldn't. Right. Unless if you really feel in your own personal circumstances, carefully, methodically, logically looking at it, you think actually this might be something real. Like, for example, I have, as probably most of our listeners know, a reasonably sized TikTok following. But I am absolutely not, in any sense of the word, trying to make that my full-time job, right? I would much rather sit on the couch and watch a couple of movies with my wife or with friends instead of trying to increase my follower count, right? I know that is never going to be like my main thing that makes me money. Right? It just isn't. Unless I get like insanely lucky and some video goes extremely viral, right? And that would be like a luck thing, not a thing that I'm actively trying to do, right?
And because of the inherent conservative nature of all of this, because we're all, all hustle culture is a bootstraps exercise. We're not talking about luck. It's about getting up at 4 a.m. It's not about getting up at 4 a.m. and then also the algorithm spins the wheel and you magically go mega viral or something like that.
Yeah. So if you have the option not to hustle, as I currently have the option not to hustle, and I am choosing not to, I'm choosing not to devote extra hours to this online social media empire, right? Then you probably shouldn't. You should focus on enjoying your life, and you should focus on doing the things that make you happy. And if you can't afford not to hustle, as Megan said, we should be doing things. And probably if you have any extra time, right? This is one of the examples where it might be okay to hustle. You should be advocating for things that would mean that you and others don't have to do that kind of intense hustling work, that kind of working 2-3 jobs that we've been talking about the entire time. I feel like that kind of really is the whole ballgame, right?
Yeah. Basically, yes. If you can afford to hustle, stop hustling. If you can afford to stop hustling, stop hustling. And if you can't, then let's work together to make it so that we don't all can stop hustling.
Yeah. And I'd add here, just as like sort of a final aside, before we conclude here, that
sign off from the Clayton Becker content universe.
I think probably few of our listeners are in this kind of like hustle culture milieu, as it were, right? Probably. I don't know who all of you are. But I think there's also a role here for those of us who see friends and family falling into this kind of hustle culture, falling into the sort of like, actually, Ashton Hall is the goal, and I should be getting up at 4 and dunking my face in sparkling ice water several times in the morning and spending 4 minutes floating in the air while I'm diving. If you see that kind of thing happening for a friend or a family member, you should try to de-influence them. Like, you should try to disabuse them of that notion. You should tell them about the negative health impacts. You should try to direct that energy towards the advocacy that we've been talking about, where, you try to make the economy and like just life better for people so they don't have to hustle, right? Even if you personally aren't in this environment, right? You can still have a positive impact on other people's lives. Because I think the reason this has such cultural staying power is because so many people think that it's a good idea. Because so many people in the sort of culture writer, lifestyle influencer, general like life space, right, present it as such, because it's become so culturally normalized. Because someone says they're hustling, and the worst thing that you do is you like look at them and you're like, that's a little bit weird, dude, right?
Hard to replace an idea with nothing. It's hard to replace an idea with the absence of that idea. I think it has to be replaced, as we're discussing, with a focus not inward on self-improvement, but a focus outward on community.
Yeah. And I think a focus outward on community isn't mutually exclusive with self-improvement. Other people make you better, right? Like, no one has ever like achieved, their final state, their best self, just through their own personal effort without anybody else to interact with and help them along the way. We are all better when we are all better, if that makes sense. And I think that when it comes to sort of the cultural piece that we're talking about here, the abstraction away from policy, the things that we can do as individuals, we can, not do these things ourselves. And then we can also work to help make them a little less normalized. We can help to point out to people that hustle culture is new, that there's nothing natural or inevitable about it, and that, quite frankly, a better world is possible. One where they don't have to hustle, and one where they don't feel that it is necessary. One where they're not pressured to do so by external influences that they then internalize to feel like are the natural impulses that they themselves have always had. That's what I got. That's what we got for this episode. We will see you guys on the next one. I am Clayton Becker.
And I am Megan Cox.
And we will see you guys next time.